آزادی بیان.
言论自由
Free speech.
We have two of India's most distinguished lawyers. We have first of all Mr. Andhyarujina, who is a senior advocate of the Supreme Court of India and was the Solicitor General of India from 96 to 98, and Advocate General of Maharashtra in 93 to 95. And we also have Mr. Harish Salve, who is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court also, and also a former Solicitor General of India, and widely recognized as one of the great appellate lawyers in this country. So we're heavy and distinguished lawyers, and we're also delighted to have distinguished a real professor, Daya Thussu, who's created the India Media Centre at Westminster University in London, and is Professor of International Communications at that university. And they'll come up in a minute, one by one, or all together, when they're one by one as they're speaking, starting with Harish Salve. Let me give you just a couple of words first about the context within which we want to set this. And let me first also give a plug to the Reuters Institute, because one of the things we do every year is to have a Reuters lecture in November. And this year, because of the importance of Indian journalism, and the fact that it's booming both in newspapers, which is now unaccustomed for us in the West, where we're accustomed, especially in journalism, to lament the fact that we're disappearing. In India, newspapers are booming, and even more television channels, which there are hundreds, grown up since the liberalization of Indian television some 20, 21 years ago. And the journalism has now taken off. There's something like 82,000 newspapers, as I say, hundreds of television channels, including hundreds of 24-hour news channels in Hindi, in English, and in various other languages as well. So because of that, we've asked a man who is the doyen of Indian television journalism, the pioneer of independent TV journalism, Roy, who created and is the CEO and was for many, many years the chief presenter of New Delhi Television, NDTV. He will give the Reuters lecture this year on the 19th, Monday the 19th of November at 5:30 in St. Anne's College. And so I very much hope that you and other members of the Indian Society and others in the university will come to that, because what he will say will be very worthwhile hearing. Indian journalism, as I say, is booming. It's very profitable. Newspapers, magazines, TV channels, radio channels are going up very rapidly, as indeed is the new media on the internet, although so far from a relatively low base. It's profitable, not universally profitable, because some of the TV channels are losing money and that they are more to provide luster and status for the people who back them rather than profitability, but many are profitable. But it also has many problems. As I learned when I was there a couple of weeks ago, I spent more than a week talking to various Indian journalists in New Delhi and Mumbai, and the complaints from many journalists and from others are of newspapers and to some extent news TV, which carry paid news and is paid for by political parties or by companies or by individuals. Sometimes that paid news is marked. It's marked out as being paid, but sometimes it isn't. There's a great deal of corporate control now, especially of the regional and local TV channels, by companies which are in other sectors of the economy as well as broadcasting and the media, and who use their media to boost their other activities, especially in areas like mining, or indeed to take on their competitors. There's a disguised weakness, I was told, in the huge circulations, especially of newspapers, because they are priced very, very low. And a number of people have said that once the pricing goes up, if and when it does, circulation will no longer be as impressive as it presently is. And above all that, what I discovered from many Indian journalists and from others was an anxiety that what is being written, and broadcast on the media is to some extent missing the point. The point being that there are many, many things wrong, as in every society. There are many things wrong in Indian society. Still very widespread poverty, growing corruption, because India's corruption index has fallen in the last few years, even as the media have become more powerful. And therefore a call, one, for a much more focused attack on the corruption in the media as elsewhere, by people in the media, but also a call for more regulation. And the UK and India now are together in this, both of them, both the UK and in India. Great anxieties about corruption, which I'll talk about later in the UK context, and about newspapers which have ignored it or indeed indulged in it themselves. The chairman of the Press Council of India, Justice Markandeya Katru, has been vocal on this. He's a stern man who reminds me, I met him once for a long talk in New Delhi, who reminds me of some of the Scots Presbyterian ministers. When I was a child, when a minister was still a minister, he was still put the fear of God in you and he had the fear of hell, or more likely. And he speaks in that way, and I was told by friends who were suave journalists, both in India and elsewhere, that, you know, he's quite mad, But he wasn't mad. He does indeed tend to lecture rather than to converse. But what he's saying is right. I also talked to one of India's most distinguished sociologists, Dipankar Gupta, who really says the same thing, milder, more cosmopolitan in his way, in his speech, but actually says the same thing. That too much of the media, they argue, is concerned with celebrity, three C's: celebrity, cricket, and another C which I'll remember later on, and not enough of the fourth C, i.e. Content. And the content, they argue, is the evils still existing in Indian society, and they argue that that is covered over by too much Bollywood, too much cricket, too much celebrity. Now, these are the kind of things we want to discuss, both by our distinguished panel and by you later on. One of the people I met in India was a man whom I, even on a brief acquaintance, grew to admire, a man called, whom some of you here will know, called Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, who is an investigative journalist, has done a good deal of both written journalism and filming, documentaries, especially in the south of India and mining areas of India, and for the Press Council of India, did a report called Paid News: How Corruption in India's Media is Undermining Democracy, which is a very, very high and serious charge, and one which Thakurta profoundly believes. So there's much to be discussed. So I'll finish there and start off the discussion with Mr. Harish Salve.
Evolution of Indian democracy. We just step back and look at it as a bigger picture rather than the immediate problems. The evolution of Indian democracy has been one of the most remarkable experiments. A country with a billion-plus population, teeming poverty, lack of literacy, forget education, huge disparities, where Bentleys and Rolls Royces share the road with bullock carts, push carts, and a very peaceful society. A friend from the United States once commented, she said, I find one huge difference between my country and your country. When I walk down the street, I see this little boy who's on a hot summer afternoon frolicking in a water leak from a municipal pipe. He looks happy, he's smiling. But that's Indians. Happen to be where they are and carry on, soldier on. And the way our democracy is developed is interesting. Here, of course, it's not developed the way the British democracy is developed. It's not gone the way the American democracy is gone, but it can't, because Indians are a different people. how we keep our freedoms, how we push our freedoms, how we preserve our freedoms has to be India specific, has to be Indian specific. And if we start with that backdrop, then it becomes far more focused to address the problem of how Indian media, and not media per se, can and should be regulated. And if it should be regulated, I must confess that in recent times, especially in the last decade, the Indian media has become the most important institution of democracy. And of late, it seems to be replacing Parliament as a forum for debating laws and legislation. The opposition walks out of Parliament, and then there is a TV debate between the leader of the opposition and the leaders of the government on whether the government policy against which they walked out is right or wrong. They prefer TV screens to Parliament to discuss their differences. Secondly, governance seems to have become more reactive than proactive. Of late, on a host of major issues, positive and negative, the trend appears to be that an article appears, a story breaks, and there is a public outcry, there is an uproar, and then the government reacts. Be it in the area of gender justice, be it in the area of economics. String of articles come saying policy paralysis, leaders of industry who normally don't like to comment on political issues come out and say that this government is comatose, and we have a slew of measures of reform. You have TV debates in which everybody says India is going to sink in the next 4 weeks if nothing is done. You have a slew of reforms. On corruption, you have stories followed by policy instead of policy followed by stories. So, media seems to be driving governance in the last, especially in the last 5 to 7 years. This has become also a cause for concern because of the structural change which we've seen, which came into media. In the old days, we had a handful of newspapers. We had the Times of India, which was started pre-independence days. Possibly one of the most powerful newspapers. You had the Hindustan Times, Mr. Birla had started part of the freedom movement, and then it continued. But now these papers have the kind of reach which regional newspapers. Hindi newspapers. The eyeball count, the eyeball attraction of the regional newspaper is huge. And some of the leading newspapers, which are over 4 and 5 decades old, they were the ones which earlier occupied the media space, belonged to a handful of families who were primarily in the media business. Everything has changed. Everything changed with the electronic media. Pranay Roy started NDTV. He was followed. NDTV for years was the only real private channel. Then you had a host of other channels, followed by then the Times of India group getting into it, setting up Times Now. Then you have the CNN IBN, CNN getting in, partnering with IBN. Each of them now are multi-million ventures because they have to be. They need equipment, they need journalists, they need reach. You have Hindi channels, you have regional channels, which have huge reach far beyond the English channels. The ZTV News, or the Aaj Tak News, or so many other channels. Then you have the regional language channels. You have Marathi channels in Maharashtra, you have Gujarati channels in Gujarat, you have the southern language channels. And I'm given to understand the single largest content or viewership is of the southern channels because they come in the whole south of India, they are shown all over India. People who understand those languages want to watch them. And these are all multi-million industries. And the way some of these have been commercially structured is something which is a cause for concern. We don't know whether it's true or false, but one of the allegations in the 2G spectrum scam cases, that a large part of the money went into a TV channel in South, belonging to one of the regional parties. Political parties have started setting up TV channels. There's public gossip that it's an acknowledged fact that the Maran family, which is closely connected with DMK, owns one TV channel, and there's public gossip that there is a TV channel called Jaya TV, which belongs to the political arch rival. Surely, I would not be very surprised if the news on the DMK channel is not really pro-Jaya and vice versa. Now, when these kind of things happen, the structuring of TV channels and seeing the role it is playing does, in my perception, create an area of potential conflict. We have seen large corporate investment in TV channels, which has to be. Now, what happens when corporate wars spill over into court? And I can tell you of a war which is over, so I can speak freely about it. The Reliance brothers battle. Reliance Industries versus Reliance Natural Gas, the younger brother owning the company, or the principal shareholder of the company which had the gas asset, the younger brother saying in a family division, you have to give it to me. The case was in the High Court, in the Supreme Court, and every single day there was a news report. There was TV coverage. And I did find there are certain channels who would argue the elder brother's case more strongly than I did. And there were certain TV channels which very conveniently twisted around everything which we argued in court and presented it very differently. And this went on from day to day, to an extent that when the case was being heard in the Supreme Court, I was addressing the court. Justice Ravindran asked me that, well, Mr. Salve, you're reading the clause that says a suitable agreement will be arrived at. What if it can't be arrived at? Should it go for arbitration? A ticker started 30 seconds later saying, Supreme Court suggests arbitration in the brothers' gas dispute. It was a question the judge asked. I said, no, it can't go. Certain provision of the Companies Act. He says, please deal with it in your turn. And the case went on. But a ticker started saying, Supreme Court says arbitrate. Reliance Industries, which has 2.5 million shareholders, their share tanked by 15%. Now, in a scenario like this, you also have to factor in another important gap in India, which is peculiar to India. In any other country, the media is very careful of what they report. If they get hit in an action for defamation, if they get hit in an action for berating somebody's reputation, for invading somebody's privacy, they are in serious trouble. In India, who cares? You have a dysfunctional court system where judges actually feel that a defamation case is a luxury litigation. You must have recently read the current law minister has filed a suit for defamation. You will be lucky if the pleadings are completed by 2015. Who cares? So you're free, and you publish today, you destroy somebody's reputation. 8 years later, if a decree is passed against you, who cares? So in this scenario, is media regulation necessary? And if so, what should be its structure? We have to remember one thing, that under the Indian Constitution, content control is not ruled out. Sub-Article 2 of Article 19 speaks of restrictions on issues such as defamation, based on defamation, sovereignty of state, relationship between friendly states and so on, public order, which means that there can be content control compatible with the Indian notion of free speech. The Indian Supreme Court has so far read that clause restrictively. Until very recently, it was considered to be a preferred freedom because no general notion of reasonableness could be imposed. Whether that has changed after the recent media judgment, one doesn't know, because there are a couple of sentences which say, like all other articles, Article 19 is subject to the principle of reasonableness, the logic of which, frankly, I have not quite figured out. But the point is, there is a degree of content control which our constitution recognizes. Who should control is the second issue. The question of the government controlling simply doesn't arise. That's not even up for discussion. So then, which institution can control the media? The courts perish the thought. Let me tell you, the Indian Supreme Court, in theory and on larger constitutional principles, has been pro-freedom of speech. There is no question about it. When it comes to government controlling media, the Supreme Court has always been there to protect the freedom of speech. Although they have not ever been averse to content control. In Abbas's case, they upheld censorship of movies. Whether it was the newsprint control sought to be imposed, euphemism really for what Mr. Palkewala described as newspaper control. In the emergency, when Mrs. Gandhi trying to control the big newspapers, or any other measure such as banning of controversial movies, TV serials. The movie, one South Indian movie was banned, which spoke about reservations and things. The Supreme Court intervened and struck it down. The TV serial was challenged. The Supreme Court said nothing of the sort. It deals with partition, the problems which occur in partition should be shown. These are controversial subjects, but we will speak about them. And recently, 4 states banned a movie which dealt with reservations. And 3 of the states, of course, backed down. 1 state contested and lost. And the Supreme Court said reservations are a problem in India and you must have debates, and in banning it is illegal. Interestingly, having won the first round on getting the banning struck down, we have now taken it to the second one. Happens to all. Having won the first round, we have now taken it to the second round based on the principle of awarding damages for violation of constitutional rights. We filed a petition in the Supreme Court saying for the days it was banned, the government should be asked to compensate, and they issued notice. Let's see where we go with it. So the courts have been protective, but for content control, the courts are not appropriate. One living example, there was a movie called Bandit Queen. And somebody challenged the censors. The censors passed that movie. It was challenged by a public spirited citizen saying, how can you allow this movie? A very fine judge who later came to the Supreme Court, was one of our best judges, and then became chairman of the Indian Law Commission, Justice Jagannath Rao, very, very fine judge. Conservative. He said, how can you have a movie like this? How can you show a woman being treated like this? How can you show a woman using expressions like this? How can you show a woman using foul language like this? And he struck down the censor certificate. He brought it in appeal. We were lucky we had a judge like Justice Daucha, who was then in the Supreme Court. A liberal who said this is a nonsense. How can you sit in judgment on all this? And if it is a story, I remember his expression, it's a story of a worm turning. It's how that woman was driven to desperation and became a bandit. And you must show this story. So that only shows you can't leave it to judges. I know of a case where a story was being done on a former Chief Justice of the Madras High Court. The news channel sent him a sheet of questions. They said, sir, we are going to do a story on it. And the editor of the news channel used expressions which are very common to journalists. He said, this is my storyline, and we want your comments before we run it so that it's a fair article or it's a fair piece. That judge put it before his brother judges who took it on the judicial side, issued notice in contempt and prohibited its screening. We filed an appeal in the Supreme Court. And when I moved the appeal, one of the judges sitting with the Chief Justice asked me, Mr. Salve, your channel wants to run stories. I said, well, which story? It's factual. He said, no, it's called storyline. Sorry, that's a technical expression for the structure of what we're doing. He said, no, we can't allow you to run storyline. And believe me, they refused to vacate that. The Chief Justice said, if you have these kind of allegations against a sitting Chief Justice, why don't you come to me? I said, but that's one solution. The other solution is if a media is willing to risk speaking about a sitting Chief Justice, how can you stop them? Your contempt jurisdiction is not meant to gag the media. And if you can see the questions which they have asked him, they all pertain not to his private life, they pertain to his functioning as a Chief Justice. And if they go over the line, you can hold them up in contempt, you can do whatever you want, but how do you stop this? And they, believe me, they refused. Chief said, no, you come and meet us and we will do this and we will do that. And finally that story now came out. So, you can't leave it to the judges. It will go by the individual predilection of the judge. A conservative judge will say, sorry, you can't have this. A liberal judge will say, of course you must have it. Two judges will take diametrically opposed views. The court is unfit to deal with media control. Secondly, there is no structure by which they can deal with media control. Every case can't come to the court. Every case can't be heard by the court. Who then regulates? Indian media has tried self-regulation. They have the National Broadcasters Association. It has worked. Perhaps not as well as it should work, it has worked. Before this, they had the Press Council, which is chaired by Justice Karpil, whom you mentioned. He initially was extremely popular in the media, now his popularity has waned for reasons which are not far to seek. So, this leads us to the next logical step. Something like the National Broadcasters Association. They have moral authority over media channels. The big channels do fall in line. On one particular issue which came up recently, they issued strict guidelines saying you will not show certain things, and nobody showed that. Otherwise, Indian coverage can be, in the pursuit of sensationalism, I'm sorry to say, it can get very gory and unnecessary and insensitive. But they have listened on occasion to the National Broadcasting Association. What is it that needs to be regulated? I classify them as two broad issues. Issues of integrity and issues of responsibility. Issues of integrity would cover ownership of media. There should be complete transparency. Who has invested in which channel has to be in public domain. There is a case going on right to privacy filed by Mr. Ratan Tata, and in the course of which one of the issues which came up was whether some of the exposures, some of the leaks of recording tapes of a particular lady who had links with business houses was also a byproduct of corporate warfare. And some of the channels who played it up, or some of the news magazines published. I was surprised when people from the Tata Group who have access to inside corporate information came out with the way those were structured. I had no idea of how many business groups have invested what kind of money. One of India's largest industrial groups. Both the Reliance headed by Mr. Mukesh Ambani, the Reliance headed by Mr. Anil Ambani, and huge investments in media. Huge investments. And believe me, very little of this is in the public domain. I can't speak more about Reliance Industries investments for reasons of secrecy. But, and they are not the only one. The number of industrials, big industrial houses which have invested in media is huge. And today investment can be structured. One company somewhere gives a loan to or buys preference shares of another company which invests in a third company which invests in your industrial company, and that money finds its way into the media house. So if you are trying to show on face that there is an investment, you can't prove it. But is that money filtered through? Yes, the money has filtered through. What is the extent of their influence? I don't know. But I find it hard to believe that hard-nosed, profit-driven industrial houses will invest for the joy of developing democracy. And that they will never, promise never interfere with journalistic freedom. I find it hard to believe. What's the way out? Media needs the money. So the money has to be invested. Transparency and some regulation, not by the government. Regulation by the government in this area is, believe me, is dangerous. One senior industrialist who I know has discrete investments in media once gave me an interesting comment. He said, it's a great insurance to invest in the media. I said, right. He said, earlier when you met certain politicians, they reach out for reporting. He said, now they are happy to tell you, listen, the channel has been beating me up a bit, you go a little easy. Or some such favor. So, the myth of journalistic freedom and government regulation, government control in this area will be dangerous, because then it is two people teaming up to actually take over the third institution, which is to be a check and balance on both. It has to be an independent regulation. Issues of responsibility, sensationalism, something which has been a great concern of the NBA. Justice J.S. Verma, who heads the NBA, the ombudsman, speak to him sometimes. He is furious on the kind of sensationalism they resort to. And in India, this absolute race to produce breaking news, because that is what gets you viewership, has led to huge distortion. In one case which happened in Delhi, there was breaking news about how a principal of a college was pushing young girls into prostitution. It was on a regional channel, Hindi channel. That poor lady's house was burnt. She was lynched. No evidence was found. And later on the journalist said, I'm sorry, but somebody had told me this is what caused. Nobody could undo the damage. What all that breaking news broke could never be repaired. Campaigns against corruption. You will hear a campaign against corruption for 3 days, which is then overtaken by some other breaking news. salacious stories. I'm sorry to say, Indian media's campaign against corruption is not a campaign against corruption. It is in no real difference from their coverage of the other two C's, cricket and celebrities. You have to pick up a big name and you have to say so and so is corrupt. This paper found, that paper found, doesn't matter, half true, half false. Show something. It's always about so and so is corrupt. Nobody speaks about there is a huge area of discretion which is causing corruption in this system. Why was there corruption in telecom ministry? Why has the government refused for the last 15 years, after setting up a regulatory system, to give that system the power to give licenses? Why have they not done that? No discussion. You will only hear so and so minister do that. Why has the coal scandal erupted? Why has for years the government refused to accept the suggestion that there has to be transparency in the allocation of mining leases? It should be by auction or some public known method. It should be in public gaze. Distribution of natural resources cannot be by processes which are opaque. Never something you will hear a discussion on TV channels. What you will hear on, have you heard the latest scandal? So-and-so's cousin got a coal mine, so-and-so's cousin got this. We discuss it till next day you catch somebody else and say, oh, somebody's son-in-law made money. So the story changes. And the story goes on and on. And what you are creating by this is a general sense of disillusionment in and across the board in the citizens of India. You are trying to convince people that every politician is corrupt, everybody is corrupt, our systems are corrupt, our parliament doesn't work. All right, that's the problem. So what's the solution? No discussion, no focusing on issues. And this is the problem of irresponsibility. Obviously the government has no role to play in this, but we need somebody to draw certain lines. And if you damage somebody's reputation, you file a suit, it doesn't work. So I have suggested a model which has not been very happily received. I helped them draft the NBA guidelines. Harish Salve, one of the senior journalists, he had come, he looked at the guidelines which are in so many countries, wrote the NBA guidelines, they are very well written. But some of them have candidly confessed that, sir, some of the bigger channels listen, but the smaller channels, they don't care. Justice Verma sent them an admonition, it goes into a dustbin, who cares? So I had suggested to them, why don't you tell the government that you set up by law an organization in which there can be an ombudsman, there should be a collegium of the press who appoints people on that panel, coming from the media. We have to find a solution. Yes, no institution is perfect, no system can be perfect. Create somebody who can deal with these content problems, and if you are worried about overkill or if you are worried about something going wrong, you can provide for an appeal to the High Court, to the Supreme Court for certain orders if they go overboard. But we need to create some mechanism. Nobody has seriously looked at this. One of the issues also where the media has a very vital role to play is helping solve the fundamental and the most deep-rooted problem which leads to corruption in India. The most fundamental problem of India is funding of Indian elections. Every member of parliament makes a false declaration the day he enters parliament, almost to that, saying he has spent only so much. What's the solution? Electronic campaign. The media, I am told, considers elections to be one of the most profitable times as far as they are concerned, during time of election. If we have a self-regulatory system which can address this problem, can address the issues of integrity and address the issues of responsible journalism. I think it will be a huge help in managing this what appears to be otherwise an unmanageable Indian democracy.
Just to give you a sense of the growth of both TV and print media in India and the projected growth, as you can see from the graph, it is all going upwards. Similarly, if you look at daily newspapers, John had a figure of 82,000, which is the latest figure. This chart stops at 2008. And this is a remarkable figure, given that we hear with worrying regularity how major newspapers are closing in Europe or in America. Newspapers of the standard of Chicago Tribune are facing problems, and as you know, Newsweek announced last week that it's going to go digital only from January. Most remarkable growth has been, as John mentioned in his introduction, this television news. I mean, I'm sure most of you know, but if you don't, I just want to remind you that until 1991, India had one state television channel. So it was monopoly, it was state monopoly. Today, the figure is something in the range of 130 and counting. And if you include the channels which have some news in it, these are 24/7 news channels. Those who claim to have news or factual entertainment, the numbers are much higher. I'm reminded of this famous book, The Million Mutinies Now, that V.S. Naipaul, famous Indian, man of Indian origin, wrote about what was happening in India when he went there in the early 90s. It was very sharply contrasting what he had written about his country of origin in his two previous books about India. And I think that revolution has also affected media industry across the country. And as John said, it is not just in the elite pan-Indian English language media where there has been a significant growth, but the most exciting change actually has been in India's many regional language media, both television, radio, newspapers, and increasingly internet. So is this growth actually enriching or eroding the public discourse? As my distinguished predecessor mentioned, the Indian political system is a very complex system. There's no other system like that anywhere in the world. And Indians are rightfully conscious and proud also of the fact that despite all the very serious and deep problems, both societal and economic, India has been able to manage as a democracy. And I would argue that this massive expansion has actually expanded that discourse. Just to give you some indication of that, here are three examples from some of the national television channels about voting, about development issues, about how to deal with the budget. There is an increasing layer of argument that you see on our broadcasters, on the speaker broadcasters. But unfortunately, this is only true of a very few networks. Most of the networks, because they are operating in this extremely competitive and crowded news space, they tend to take the easy route, and that easy route is to deal with issues which don't really matter, they don't really expand or enrich the public discourse. And they represent what I have called in some other context 3 C's of infotainment. Something I wrote a few years back, a book about global infotainment, and I have a chapter in it looking at specifically India and especially television news in India. And the 3 C's that I sort of categorized this in was crime. This was in relation to the terrorist attack in Mumbai and how that was covered, especially by television. I called it the tamasha of terrorism, so I don't need to translate that word for most of you here. The other C is the obsession with cricket, and yesterday we had a very interesting session about that. And you wouldn't have 2020 cricket if you didn't have 24/7 television. So it's not just about a sport, it is now a package which is largely driven by entertainment. So the phrase cricketainment sums that up rather well. And that leads to my final C, which is, I think, the most important. So it's a suggestion to my young colleagues here next year, maybe think of a panel on Bollywood and globalization of Bollywood. Because, one of the great things of my job is I travel a little bit, and wherever I go, people will say, okay, you're Indian. The first thing they talk about is Bollywood. It doesn't matter which country it is. But this Bollywood is also increasingly taking over the public discourse. And it's not just in the entertainment section of a news bulletin or entertainment pages of newspapers. It's actually getting front page treatment. And I was very pleased to hear yesterday the Vice Chancellor demonstrated how well informed he was about the latest Bollywood news. He mentioned Saif and Karina's wedding and the kind of war coverage it received on Indian television. It's so big that Bollywood itself is taking it seriously. Here are 2 examples of films specifically looking at this ratings battle and what it is doing to Indian democracy. One in a more serious vein, the other one is a more sort of a satire on poverty, rural poverty. Particularly problematic has been something which both, you referred to it, but John mentioned it specifically, the idea of paying for editorial space and presenting it as advertisements, the idea of paid news. This, I would argue, is one of the ugliest side of this excessive marketization of Indian media and has very serious implications for democracy. Indeed, this has become a major subject of debate within the industry and I'm happy to report also in academia, one of my students is actually doing a PhD on this topic, this precise topic. What gets lost in this kind of infotainment-driven Bollywoodized content is the fact that India remains home to the largest number of poor people in the world. The figures vary, but we can safely say we're talking about 300 million plus. It also is home to the largest number of illiterate people in the world. It also is home to the largest number of child labor in the world. So, if you look at any index, you will find that India actually fares pretty badly, and understandably so. We had a very insightful panel this morning looking at the welfare situation in India. And that doesn't have to be like this, because India has a tradition of a different kind of journalism. A journalism which is in public interest, a journalism which is not just driven by the whims of the market. And that goes back quite a bit. In fact, the father of India's nation, Mahatma Gandhi himself, was arguably India's greatest journalist. He wrote in his mother tongue, which is Gujarati, but also wrote extensively in English. And these were read by millions of people. Not just in the subcontinent, but outside of it too. So there is a tradition of public service broadcasting, public service media, public service journalism, which I think, because of what I've described as this kind of global infotainment and its impact in India, has tended to be marginalized. It is interesting to remind ourselves that none of the major newspapers in India, or the Hindu, has a rural affairs correspondent in a country where 60+% of people live in the country, in rural areas. None of the major networks, NDTV, it might be a slight exception, who actually regularly cover rural affairs, because their audience is very urban, middle class, English speaking. They are not really interested. So that leads me to my final section, and I don't want to say a lot about that, because I hear I've got people much better qualified than me to speak about what should be done in terms of regulation. But just to say a few words about industry surplus, which has already been mentioned. Of course, the press was regulated the press council has been there for some time, and also because press has a much older history, there is a tradition of self-regulation. That isn't the case with broadcasting, because also broadcasting is a much bigger industry, a lot more money is involved, and political interests and other interests are much more subtle, the ownership structures, for example. So how do you regulate the broadcasting? Already there has been some progress, especially post-Wait News episode. The News Broadcasting Association, which was mentioned earlier, has been set up, and the News Broadcasting Standard Authority, chaired by Justice Verma, is already in place. And my sense of, it's early days, so you can't really come to any conclusive statement, but my sense is, talking to people in the industry and journalists, that it seems to be working. Because, as was mentioned earlier, there's some really good people involved with it, so they have certain reputations, such as Verma, for example, has their absolutely applicable credentials. But there are others. You heard this. Sorry, I've already mentioned that. You've already heard of Justice Garju, who is a bit more skeptical about self-regulation. He says there's no such thing as self-regulation, which is an oxymoron. Everybody is accountable to the people in a democracy, and so is the media. As was mentioned earlier, when he started, he got very good press. When they took over the press, the Press Council of India late last year. But since then, journalists are a bit worried about some of his forthright attitude and his directness. Now, just a few reflections on the future. As I said at the beginning, the growth has been astonishing. I can't think of any other country where the media have grown so fast in such a short period of time. But if you do a comparative analysis, television penetration in India is, these are the latest figures, is only 61%. So we're talking about there are potentially 400 million people who are not watching television. Similarly, if you look at newspaper reach, it's merely 42%, which means 600 million people are not reading a newspaper. So the scope is massive. Also, there has been a very significant growth in literacy in the last 10 years, particularly, partly as a result of the welfare measures that the government has introduced. More than 223 million people have become literate. So, these issues of regulation are going to bothering us. More and more people are going to be reading newspapers, and television is also going to grow. Some final reflections about the new media. Because although just over 10% of Indians are online, which translates into 110 million people, but with 3G coming in and mobile internet becoming a reality, which will happen in the next 5 years, if not sooner, I think it's going to change. It's going to change the way we think about the internet. So, how do you regulate content there? That's a difficult one, as we all know. Yesterday, Minister Ajay Markan told us about India's demographic dividend, that there are a lot of young Indians ready to work for the world. They're increasingly producing content, distributing content, and given their capacity to do this work in English language, they're increasingly talking to a global audience. So a few points about this. The Information Technology Act has been in effect since 2009, and it actually expands government's power to censorship and to monitor content. According to Google Transparency Report in 2011, India made most number of requests globally to Google for removal of content. There are questions about slander and sensationalism, how you can use the new media to sully people's reputation. It happens frequently. And also the question in relation to hacking and cyber espionage. Just to close with my few final thoughts on the key question. Should we regulate or not? Who should regulate? I would argue in a country of India's diversity, complexity, and the multi-layered nature of its media system, the need to regulate content remains. It has social, cultural, and security implications. And I think sometimes we get carried away by this hype associated with freedom, a particular version of freedom, often emanating from the United States. And that doesn't take into account the complexity of a country like India, where there are multiple stakeholders, multiple levels of complexities. The other point, I think it's been mentioned earlier about increasing tendency towards concentration of media power and the potential to misuse that power. This happens all over the world, particularly in Indian problem. But I think both the policy people and particularly the intellectual community has often tended to ignore this in Indian context. Very little discussion of it in public, and very little information about it in public domain, partly because a lot of people who invest, not a lot, but many people who invest in this have money coming from questionable means. The other problem is growing corporate control of means of expression. this worries me at a different level also, in terms of how the terms of debate are framed, how narrow that spectrum is. So it's sort of extreme pro-market or moderate pro-market. And that, in ideological terms, worries me. There's a lot of discussion, for example, and Mr. Salve, I've seen you on NDTV, for example, to bring that other side of the argument. But by and large, the debate is rather narrowly focused. And there's a great deal of discussion about corruption, for example. It's the fashionable topic and the flavor of the month at the moment. But very little discussion of corporate corruption, of what the transnational corporations are doing. That doesn't come into television or even in newspapers. Government is an easy target. And there are reasons to complain and to expose the misdeeds that happens regularly, but that's only one part of the story. There's a story which often the media doesn't focus on. So I'll end with just a plea and a hope that this extremely powerful media will be a little more responsible and exercise that power with responsibility. I used to work at Goldsmiths College in London, and my colleague, Professor James Curran, who is a great authority on British media, wrote a wonderful book called Power Without Responsibility, looking at the British media. And I'm shamelessly borrowing from him, and I'm saying that actually power with responsibility is what the media is. Thank you.
We have today a situation which requires serious consideration, and that is why this particular type of debate is there. We have the globalization of news through the satellite, television and internet, and it is that which has made the world of difference to the responsibility of the media. Today we speak of media not in the sense of a printed media, which it was there some years ago. Today we have, as Professor Thussu spoke, of 1 million media today controlling everybody's lives. And the printed media probably is now in the background, particularly in a country like India with its vast illiteracy. Today, television can reach into the villages and it can be seen by villagers, whereas the actual media by way of press is certainly limited. As he pointed out, 42% of the press today is in printed media only, whereas I am very sure that it is much more by way of television. And the grasping nature of television, the grasping nature of the visual scene which you get on television right to the poor and humble villagers is something which is unique today. And that is the question which today we have to consider, whether you, in these circumstances, should you not have some sort of a regulation of this type of a media which plays sometimes havoc on the lives of the people. Now let me tell you how, in one particular instance today in India, it has really been of tremendous concern, and that is in respect of an incident which happened when in Bombay there was a terrorist attack on 2008, and there was the television media which was actually taking scenes of the security forces which were taking action against terrorists who are holed in a particular premises. And believe me, there's a terrorist who took advantage of the viewing of it on the television to take actions to prevent any action by the terrorists. That was the glaring example of how an irresponsible televisions today helps and destroys the security. Now when that happened, that was a matter which was so prominent that in a recent case which related to that particular incident of the 9/11, etc., the Supreme Court had to make an observation. And I'm going to read out to you this. Justice Aftab Alam, one of the finest judges of our Supreme Court, said in this conviction of the terrorist under this attack, he says, it is in such extreme cases that the credibility of an institution is tested, credibility of this media. The coverage of the Mumbai terror attack by the mainstream electronic media has done much harm to the argument that any regulatory mechanism for the India must come only from within. This is the aspect of the matter which one has to consider, and this is brought out vividly by the incident in relation to the security of the state. Today, the media which we are speaking of, which really requires control, is not the printed media, which is itself a different problem, I'll come to that, but certainly in respect of this particular TV aspect of the thing is a matter which is of deep concern. Now, you see, even in respect of this media, which is the whole media and the responsibility of the media, this is a matter of great concern. We have a statement by Justice Kaju. Maybe he is a bit exaggerating it, but it requires serious concern. This is what he has said, and he said it in a very typical way, which he spoke about. He said, I'll just read out to you what he said. He says, another cause for disquiet for the media in 2011, he said, he accused the journalists of having a poor intellectual level and declared that he had a poor opinion of the most media people. Frankly, I don't think they have much knowledge of economic theory, which I think is correct, or political science, or literature, or philosophy. He's asking for too much of journalism. Justice Kaju demanded more teeth for the council and called for the electronic media to be brought under his purview. As for the powers he sought, he declared, I want powers to stop government advertisement. I want to suspend the license of that media for a certain period if it behaves in a very obnoxious manner. Now, following upon that, what happened is interesting. He made the press council pass a resolution, and they passed a resolution on August 27th of this year, wherein it resolved for granting more powers to it, coupled with the conversion into a Media Council of India, bringing the electronic, so far the Press Council of India doesn't have the power over electronic media, bringing the electronic broadcast and social media within its purview. The PCI, the Press Council of India, has also requested the government to amend the Press Councils Act 1978 as contemporary circumstances warrant the same. The aforesaid resolution further rubbishes the claim of broadcast media of self-regulation being futile and meaningless, as regulation, as according to his expression, is an oxymoron. The resolution further states that the unregulated media is playing havoc with the lives of the people, referring to the plight of the people of Northeast in August this year. There was a disturbance in the northeast of India, and that was played up in a way which the press actually, it exaggerated it in such a way as to cause further disturbance there. Now, this is the reaction of the media to this particular resolution. The news broadcasters were quick in vociferously demanding and opposing the move tooth and nail. Not only the NBA, but also the Indian Newspaper Society expressed their stiff resistance in bringing electronic media under the purview of the Press Council of India. Even questions were raised in the absence of a due unanimity during the passage of the above resolution. So this is the resistance which you today get from this particular body. It's a powerful body. Now, what do you therefore do in this matter? Now, today we are concerned not only with the media of the electronic, which is in this matter completely dominating the whole scene and hitting the minds of the people in a manner in which the printed media was not there. Today, globalization is most necessary. Can you therefore control today the electronic media? Today we have over, take for example, a channel like the CNN. It has over 200 million households in the world reaching, etc. Can you really control it? And in that sense is the greatest problem today. And as somebody said, it's like King Canute saying, asking the waves to stop. It's impossible to stop it. That's the difficulty of passing any even order by the court. A court says you, the media, will not report this particular trial because it prejudices the trial. But by the time that the media is already circulated throughout the world and you can't control it. This is the problem. It's really like King Canute saying, stop the waves, don't touch my feet. Yet, it is most necessary. How do you bring this about? And today, this is the greatest problem so far as we are concerned. Apart from that, just see this consequence of the security problem. As a result of what happened in the Mumbai attack, which facilitated the terrorists, etc., the Chief of Naval Staff, he came on the scene and said that government must now regulate the electronic media. And government itself suggested, for the first time, because government is very shy of controlling the media, because it's accused them of taking away the most fundamental liberty of the citizens under Article 19(1)(a), government suggested that we will make an amendment to the Cable Television Network Act rules of 1994 and to examine the failings and to self-regulating but then immediately thereafterwards the Broadcasters Association said nothing doing, we will self-regulate ourselves, etc. And can there be therefore anything like that? But then you might have a commission. If that commission is really self-regulating and has the strength of a body which in the United Kingdom, you might be knowing, sir, it's called the Commission in UK, Ofcom or something like that, and that is a powerful body which controls and which is under the control. But today, if you are not members of that association in India, you cannot be regulated, and there is no really teeth in the commission. What do you do in these matters? Now, therefore, this is the most important thing about electronic media today to be controlled. Are we doing something like asking like King Canute saying, stop it, but you can't stop it? And the Constitution of India does not permit a legislation which takes away the freedom of the speech except for certain matters that presently point out to you. Therefore, this is the problem in India. Now take otherwise the non-TV media, the conventional media. Here also you have a requirement of real self-regulation amounting to actually control of that. You have today a phenomenon in India of what is called paid news. At the election time, the parties are actually paying newspapers to publish their own viewpoint and to attack the opposition. And it's put so subtly that you never know it's paid news. This happened in Maharashtra during the elections, last election, and there was actually a paid news in favor of a particular congressional candidate, but nobody knew about it, that it was a matter of paid news. And this is uniformly on a particular date, comes in every newspaper about it, so you then realize that it's a matter of paid news. And therefore, this is the paid news is the problem. Now, more than anything today, you have another aspect of the media which is very disconcerting. Openly, it is said that the media and the press, which is today controlled largely by financial and commercial considerations. You have advertisements, you have big commercial houses controlling and financing the newspapers, because you can't have revenue from newspapers which will make the newspapers self-supporting. It's impossible to get sufficient revenue from the daily price of a newspaper. You have to then rely upon other houses, commercial houses. And as big a house as the Times of India, which is the largest circulating English paper in the world, the Economic Times is next after that. It, in an interview with the New York Times, the proprietors of it, giants, openly said, we are here dependent upon business houses to finance us. They enter into what is called a commercial treaty to buy equity of another company, and that company itself finances the paper. So this is an aspect which is so prominent. Today it's an amazing thing that the most prominent newspapers of India, which are there, on the first and the second pages are not headlines, but they are advertisements for real estate, like something like that. So this is the degradation of the printed media by the commercial sense. What are we doing about that? As Mr. John Lloyd pointed out, there was a Paranche Gupta committee. It required control over this, but those recommendations of the committee were were denounced by the press. This is we are talking about that's what Lord Bryce-Upper spoke about, that the control of the press is something so important but it's so difficult, and he called it as that aspect of yellow journalism. Now, therefore, this is the thing which is taking place. Now, see the type of cases which are being, the news which is being broadcast day after day, and in the newspapers, etc. What is the sensation which is done? The sensation is about disproportionate coverage of events. For example, corruption. Corruption is the leading topic today. It takes the headlines. The 9 o'clock news of every channel is full of corruption, aspects of corruption. First it was Anna Hazare, a man who went on to fast for so many days and created a sensation. He confessed that but for the television news who covered it, I would not have had this particular importance in India. Next comes his colleague, who is somebody called Kejriwal, who then now exposes so many people. That is the coverage which is given in India, etc. And how much of that, and it is so disproportionately put up. Every channel carries everybody's views in the matter. In the next day's newspapers, if you look at it, the aspect is very little. But this is the mind on which the TV today focuses in the matter. Take, for example, what has happened in Parliament. In India, there is no reporting of the debates in Parliament, if at all there take place a debate. But if you have a situation, as in the last monsoon session, if you have Parliament obstructed by demonstrations in the wells of the House, and for the whole monsoon session wiped out, all that is completely reported by the press. And therefore politicians say, we'd much rather obstruct the Parliament than to make any debate in the House, and the press places it up in a big way. Take criminal trials. You have today criminal trials like the Talwar case. For the last 1 year, that the media plays upon the trial in such a way. If there was a jury trial in India, which fortunately is not, the jury have been by now completely influenced by the media as to the guilt of these people. How do you control this particular aspect of the matter? Not that the media does not play a good role. For example, in a case which is called the Jessica Lal case, it was the media which says that this person could not have been acquitted. And that accused thereafter was the High Court itself issued a notice and said, in view of what the trial court has done, we take upon itself the aspect of the matter, and the particular person was brought to book. So the media does play a part. But oftentimes the part which is played is so disproportionate that you wonder whether it really serves the public purpose. And similarly, for example, sting operations, like the telecast sting operations, the media does play a part in that, and it does help. Now, with the end of all that, do you have self-regulation or not? Or should we then leave it, as the crying demand today is, that there must be some degree of external regulation? Justice Kaju speaks of that in a very strong way. Many people who believe that media is going out of bounds should be regulated. But we in our constitution have a limitation. In the United States Constitution, you cannot put any restraint because the right to freedom of speech there is absolute. Prior restraint is impossible. You can't put it that way. In the Indian Constitution, you have a provision. We have the fundamental right of freedom of speech, which is the first particular right and under Article 19A. But that is subject to only a type of legislation which puts reasonable restrictions. And reasonable restrictions are put only, mind you, in the interest of the security of the state, in the interest of public order, decency, morality, relations with foreign state. These are limitations. You can't, therefore, media says, even legislation you cannot touch. The Constitution does not permit us to be controlled. Why should you then control us? And we will self-regulate ourselves. Self-regulation doesn't work. But there is one aspect of the matter which came up recently, and that is in respect of the court's control over the media. What happens when the media reports trials in such a distorted way as to make the fair trial impossible, which it predetermines the guilt of the person or the innocence of the person. It destroys the presumption of innocence. What is the court to do? Is it court helpless? And there is one reservation in Article 19(1)(a), and that is the power to put reasonable restrictions in the interest of contempt of court. Now, contempt of court doesn't mean you defy the court, doesn't mean you disobey the court, it also means administration of justice. And that is today a leading case which has occurred on 11th of September in the Supreme Court. It's called the Sahara India Real Estate Corporation versus the security of SEBI. And that, for the first time, the court said, we want to lay down guidelines for the press. And this occurred in a very curious way. You see, the Sahara had certain documents. It made a without prejudice offer to the SEBI, which is a controlling authority, and those documents were put on the television. And the question arose whether in such circumstances is not the trial of the case, is not the court prejudiced by that? Curiously enough, that was brought to the attention of the case of the court by Sahara itself and said, this is what has happened. And the court then said, yes, it's a very, very serious thing which is happening. And the Supreme Court was said, this is what I quoted, we are distressed to note that even without prejudice, proposals sent by the learned counsel for the appellants to the learned counsel on the other side has come on the television channels. Such incidents are increasing by day. Such reporting not only affects the business sentiments, but also interferes in the administration of justice. In the above circumstances, we have requested learned counsel on both sides to make written applications so that appropriate orders could be passed by this court with regard to reporting in the matter which is sub judice. Now, this is the origin of it. And when it came to it, the press as a whole said, you, the Supreme Court, have no business to lay down guidelines for us. This is how, although the application was made to the Supreme Court itself by one of the parties, the court considered the matter for over 3 weeks, and most of the people who advanced arguments were members of the press, they were a broadcasting association, and they stoutly said, you, the court, also doesn't have the power, even if it affects the administration of justice. But the court said, maybe we are not laying down guidelines for all times, but we are laying down guidelines, so we are saying that we have the power. We have the power in certain circumstances. If you, the press, with all your rights under Article 19(1)(a, is affecting the administration of justice, then we, the court, have the power to prevent you in that matter. Thereupon, there was a violent protest by everybody representing the press, saying that you have no power to lay the guidelines even in respect of that. The court took upon itself a great responsibility, and it's relied upon decisions in the Supreme Court of Canada, in the European Court, in other cases. And it had the benefit of an earlier decision in 1957, of 9 judges who had said, in certain circumstances the court will say, you will not report this. And they said, but this is violative of our fundamental rights in the 19(1)(a). The court said, our directives will prevail over your claim for fundamental rights of freedom of speech in such circumstances. The presumption of innocence, the fair trial, the necessity to maintain administration of justice, all this is inherent in the power of the court, they said, under the provisions of the Constitution. I won't mention it, including the power under 19(1)(a) of contempt of court, because the contempt of court means not merely punishing, it means administration of justice. And this is the decision which is laid down, which once again has not been received by the press favorably. It has criticized the Supreme Court, has taken away its freedom of reporting. Whereas in every country, which is in the Commonwealth countries, you have such control over it. This is the aspect of the matter. It requires deep consideration. I am grateful to you for this.